we're ready to start cutting out our fashion or our pattern for our main garment. Okay, you want the lining pattern to be slightly bigger than your fashion pattern. Okay, so we want the lining to actually be a little bit bigger. The reason for that is so it doesn't pull the fashion fabric in weird different ways. Okay, if it's a little loose on the inside, nobody's going to notice. Okay, little folds and stuff on the inside, nobody's going to notice. So we've prepped our fabric. We have a pattern on this fabric, so the first thing we looked for is, does it have an up direction? Okay, and if it has multiple directions, which could be considered up, you have to make the decision as to which one you like. Okay, this pattern, it's very obvious that, if I hold a piece up here, this looks like it's up right now because the little flame that's on the candle right there. Okay, that's how I consider it. If I turn this over, it's actually not bad. It still looks like it's a decent pattern, and I could see that as being up. But how's it going to lay on the skin and all that kind of stuff? I think this looks better. So that's the direction we go. When we iron our fabric, we also want to try to make sure we go down the center of one of the patterns. So if I were to iron this, I want to go down the center of this fold. That's where my fold would be. This makes cutting out the patterns a whole lot easier. Yes, it's a headache when you do it, and it's a pain when you do it in your iron, but it is so important. Now, as far as, did they iron in period? I have no idea. I know they had irons in period, and I would assume that they ironed cloth, but I don't know exactly. What's really cool, though, is if this were a back piece and I unfolded it, you can see how well the pattern matches up right now. And that's what's important, is that when we cut it, that pattern comes out matching up. I have a couple other pieces here. These two squares, okay, this square was cut on the fold. Now, these are obviously two independent squares. And, when I hold them up, we get lovely little, let's see if I can do this, mirror images, basically, of each other. So if this was like two front pieces, well, one would be on one side and one would be on the other side, and we'd have some lovely symmetry. Okay? And that's what we're going for. Okay? We're going for symmetry in the pattern itself. Okay? Other things to consider about your pattern and where you're cutting it. Okay? Richard's pattern has these giant pine cone looking like shapes on them. Okay? Where that is placed on the doublet is very, very important. If I put one on each chest piece, it will emphasize certain things. And if you want to emphasize those things, that's up to you. I'd rather place those down here where it doesn't emphasize those things. I probably want one right on the center back because that's going to look really cool. So when I cut, I want to make sure to line my back piece up so that, everything else. And we're going to do that as we lay the pattern out on the fabric. We don't just want to place pattern pieces willy-nilly on the fashion fabric. We want to have a plan as we're going along as to what the shapes are going to be. So what I do is, let's see, I'll look at this pattern, I'm looking at both sides of it, trying to decide where things are and where things are going to be and everything is this. This is a lovely repeating pattern, and it goes, it's up half a space for every row. So if I was going to do this, I'd want like this section here to be framed in the center back, with this up near the top of the collar piece. Well, that would be this section right here or this section right here. If I take my back piece and I lay it out I can lay out right about there. And that means once I unfold this, I will have this lovely section of pattern right down the center of the back. You see what I'm saying? And that's what I want, okay? So that's where I'm going to place my pattern piece. Okay, and that's what I'm going to do. Now we're using a bias tape construction method. Essentially, what that means is that instead of doing the traditional bag and sew, the traditional bag and sew is when I get to the end, I sew all the way around the edges, and then I turn like a bag, and then I turn it inside out and I press everything down. Okay, that's a standard sewing method. What we're going to do is instead we will take the edges and we will just lay them out and sandwich like a taco, a piece of bias tape around the edges. This makes construction a lot easier. This includes doing the sleeves like that. You can see our sleeves are not set in like we did on our mock-ups. Okay? It means we're going to take all those little edges, like we're going to have 3 edges to our fabric here, and we'll take the bias tape and put it over the edge, kind of like that. Kind of like a taco going over the edge. And that will keep our edges together and everything else like that, and makes construction methods a lot easier. But there's still areas where we are going to seam the fabric together just like this. Just like we did normally. So if it's an edge, okay, in other words, it's going to be a raw edge of fabric, that's where we're going to put bias tape. If it's a place on the fabric where it's going to get connected together like a regular seam, that's a seam, okay? So we got biased edges and we have seams. And that's what's important to remember when we're drawing our pattern out, okay? So we look at our back piece here. Obviously, where the collar meets, that's going to be a seam, okay? Because we're going to sew the collar into the back piece. So at that point, we're going to need a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So this is going to be fun. Yeah. Now my chalk is yellow and I'm putting it on. When you have a patterned fabric, sometimes it's difficult to see your chalk. So I would draw many, many lines and make them as dark as possible so that you can see them. Okay? The shoulder seam, obviously we're going to sew our shoulder seams together. So again, we need a 1/2 inch. Okay? Now, our armhole. We're going to put bias tape on that because we're going to be doing, bias tape construction as far as the sleeves go. We're not going to set the sleeves in. So a 1/4 inch seam allowance is all we need there. Now, why are we doing a 1/4 inch? Well, there's going to be some fraying material that's going to get caught up. If we went right on the edge, we would lose a little bit of fabric. And plus, we're also going to use a serger to serge our edge to make sure that it doesn't fray and it lasts for a really long time. So we put a 1/4 inch seam allowance on there to deal with the adjustments that we're going to make. Okay? It's really not going to make a difference in the fit, and it will look wonderful. Okay? The side seam, again, we're looking at a 1/2 inch. And then our bottom seam where our skirting goes in, we're obviously going to, Now, sometimes, depending on the thickness of the fabric, if I'm dealing with a really thick, heavy fabric, I will attach the skirting piece with bias tape, okay? Simply because there's going to be so many layers of fabric down there, okay? With this fabric, I think we'll be fine just sewing the skirting piece in. But again, completely up to you what you want to do. But, in this area, that's where it kind of gets a little iffy. But that's why I don't tell you specifically on your pattern piece, do this, do that, do this. Seam allowances are going to change depending on what fabric you're using, what pattern you're trying to accomplish, all that kind of thing. All right? So that's my back piece. My back piece is done. The next piece I go with always is my front piece. Okay? The reason I go with my back piece first and then my front piece is simply because I know my back piece is going to be on a fold. That's fine. That helps me set the direction of my fabric. I then do my front piece to make sure I'm going in the same direction on my fabric. Now, obviously, I can fit this front piece in here very nicely like that, but then that would mess my pattern up, okay? I need to take my pattern into consideration when laying out my front piece. Does it fit better if I flip it over like this? Yeah, it fits a little bit better. Again, though, I have to think what's going to be showing and which part on my front piece when I lay it out. This little flame piece could be considered an arrow. Where do we want that arrow to point? We want it to point to the nipples? Probably not. Okay, so we want to make sure that I don't lay this front piece out where, because that's right where the candle piece would be right now. No. The other thing I need to consider is the grain of the fabric. I want the front grain to be as straight as possible here. I want to place my fabric where it's going to be nice and comfy. I like that position right there. Yeah, move it up just a hair so that I have room for my again, you want to look where your seam allowances are going to be. All right, and then again, I place my weight so that things don't move, and I start drawing my seam allowances. On this one, it's going to be a 1/4 inch along the front because that's where it's going to close up and it's going to be a raw edge. That's a bias tape edge. The collar is a 1/2 inch. Shoulders a 1/2 inch. The sleeve opening is a 1/4 inch again. The side seam and the skirting piece are a 1/2 inch again. You can write these things down on your pattern, but again, if this was like a thicker, heavier fabric, I would be doing a 1/4 inch down on that skirting piece. It's just simply because it would be easier. All right? I've been known to do bias tape all the way around the piece and just construct that way because the fabric was so thick and heavy that I just couldn't do it any other way. So, and it comes down to what you're trying to accomplish and everything else like that. But in general, you're going to put bias tape along the center front, the sleeve hole, the shoulders, and everything else. Now I'm just going to leave that piece there. I'm not going to do my line check because we're going to talk about the other pieces. Okay? Your collar piece, again, you have to look at the direction. Okay? Yeah, I could fit this collar piece in a lot of different places. It's a fairly big pattern, so it's really not going to make too much of a difference where I put my collar piece. But my collar piece, the only piece I will cut my collar piece out of is out of the fashion fabric. The lining is going to be done completely separately for the collar. Okay? And you'll see why when we get to pad stitching. Okay? So I will need to cut a collar piece out at some point. I could do this on a fold, okay, because it is the collar piece. It does have a nice straight edge. I could do it on a fold right there, and that would probably actually be a really good placement for it. You're also looking at how to conserve fabric here. Okay? In period, they didn't like to waste fabric. If you look at the Spanish Tailor's Handbook and how they lay patterns out on fabric, you'll see they do a lot of things. Now, some of you may have fabric that's too narrow for your pattern. And what you'll end up doing then is called a piecing, okay? In that you will take, let's say this, we're going to pretend that this is how wide our fabric is. This is the piece we're trying to lay out on it, and oops, it doesn't quite fit there, okay? So what I would do is I would put the pattern piece and I would cut that piece out, and then I would take this section of it, cut it out on a different section of my fabric, and have an extra seam where the two sewed together. That's called a piecing. Okay? Very, very popular in period. It happened all the time, especially in skirting pieces, because skirting pieces were generally very wide, much wider than the fabric that they had. And remember, period fabrics were only 20 26 to 29 inches in width, so it wasn't a lot of fabric width to deal with there. So, you know, piecings were very, very popular, and sometimes the piecing would even go the opposite direction just to conserve fabric. There's paintings where you'll see this lovely skirt, and it's got this lion head pattern, and then you look at the corner of the dress, and the lion's heads are upside down. Because when they did the piecing, they just flipped it, just because they knew that piecing would be folded into the fabric most of the time, and you wouldn't even notice it. I've actually done this myself on purpose, just to be a little bit more period. So it is something that is popular, would be done, but you really want to try and hide the piecing if you can. Like if I was going to do a piecing, I wouldn't do the piecing in the center front, because that's going to be seen. Now the piecing would come along the side, because that's going to be not seen as much. Okay. I will bring a doublet in next time that actually has a piecing in it, so that you guys can see how I did that. Okay, but again, it just depends on where things end up laying out. The epaulette piece, again, you're going to cut 2 of these out. So you need 2 of these out of the fashion fabric. So don't try to do them on the fold. It's you'd have to cut 2 of them out. No, find an empty section and do it there. In general, you actually want the epaulette to go at an angle on the fabric itself. Okay? It's not a very wide piece, and unless you have a very, very narrow pattern, you're not going to see it. And we want to get as much of the pattern on the piece as possible. And so our direction of the fabric should flow at a 45-degree angle to our center. Generally don't want to do this like this, but if that's how it fits best on your fabric, that's how it fits best. I'll probably end up putting this one somewhere right about there. Let me stick it down here. We'll see where it fits. And again, that's where it comes down to. Where does it fit? Okay, this will actually fit probably very nicely right there. It does. It's wonderfully right there. And so I may end up putting my collar piece down here. Be aware where if you get close to an edge, make sure that you have that edge on both sides. Because sometimes fabric ends up, when you fold it, not exactly right. So you can see I'm getting a general layout of my pieces before I start drawing seam edges. Yes, I did the back piece first, and I drew the seam edges on that. That's going to be my anchor, and then I'll start laying everything else out and going with that. The skirting piece is probably the biggest pain in the butt, okay? Because it's a big, long piece, and it's never going to look right no matter how you lay it out on your pattern. There's going to be parts of it where the pattern is perfect, and you can see on this piece, this is my center front, so that's where I want it to go up and down. By the time we get to go to the center back, the pattern's actually going across it, okay? If I angle it differently and try to get it, okay, now it's going at an angle on both. And it's going to look ridiculous no matter where it is. In general, what we want is we want our pattern to match up in the front, because that's where people are going to see us the most, is from the front. Anybody that's looking at the back of my doublet shouldn't be staring at the direction of the pattern. Okay? So there we go. And then our sleeves, of course, will be on a further piece of the fabric. Now again, because we have a pattern direction on this, when I do lay my sleeves out, okay, I want the top direction to be up near the top of the sleeve. Okay? I want the bottom to be down near the cuff. So that, when I'm standing, boom. I don't want the pattern to go like this. You should think about, yes, that would look great when my arms are out straight like this. How often are my arms out like this? Very often. Now we want the pattern to match up basically when my arms are down, and that's the main position of my arms. That means the direction's going up towards the shoulder of the sleeve, and so that's the direction where I want to go. So when I do get to the sleeve part, I'll show you, I'm going to draw out these patterns first, and cut them all out, and then I'm going to show you the special thing I do with the sleeves to make it a little bit easier. Alright? So we're going to stop the camera for right now. Like I was showing Richard, rapier doublets need an extra flap in the front to, follow the rules of the overlap. On the doublet here, which is a rapier-legal doublet, get to the point where you can see the front, okay? You can see all I've done is basically sewn in what's known as a placket. It's just a rectangular piece of fabric that is sewn into the front, and this helps with my overlap, and it will follow the rules. I've got a button stand there, and so it comes in, it just stops right there. That's the way it's supposed to work, okay? To make that piece, all I did was I drew a rectangle out on my fabric. Look, here it is. I measured my front piece, approximately 18 inches, and I made an 18-inch by 5-inch rectangle. That's all I did. So I will need to make sure and cut lining pieces out in the same shape as this for, my doublet. Okay. Now, as far as the lining goes, wherever it is a piece of the body or the sleeve, you will need 3 layers at minimum, for your doublet to be rapier-legal. If it's not a rapier-legal doublet, then you can just get away with 1 layer extra, and that's it. So, for like the skirting piece, you really don't need 3 layers there, because that's just the skirting piece, and it's overlapping your pants, and it really doesn't matter. But for the front, the back, and the sleeves, you're going to need a couple extra layers. Fabric has 3 directions. You have a warp, a weft, and a bias. The warp and the weft are the horizontal and vertical lines of the fabric. Okay? The bias is the diagonal. To make a rapier-legal doublet and to make sure that it follows that, it will be able to pass a punch test, you need to change the direction of your fabric as you lay it out. Even though these are 2 completely different fabrics, they're woven in basically the same way. So since I obviously cut this back piece, I cut it on, I believe that's the weft, the vertical grain. I'm going to need to turn it for my lining piece and cut it on the opposite grain, the horizontal grain, which means now I don't have a fold. So I'm going to have to make sure there's a seam in the back of that. Other than that, I'll have to add a seam allowance to the center back. Just want to turn it and put it that way. On the next layer, I'm actually going to turn it and set it on the bias so that I'm turning it a second time. So that, and what this ensures is that all of our weaving fibers crisscross up, making it a stronger, more durable doublet, make it easier for it to pass a punch test. So the next layer we're going to do, I'm actually going to set this on the cross grain. Okay, so I'm going to turn it essentially 90 degrees and lay my pattern out. What's nice is, though, I really don't need to go around with my chalk thing anymore except for this extra little ½ inch. All I'm going to do is I'm going to lay my fabric out. I'll draw my extra ½ inch seam allowance since I'm going to need it because this is not going to be on a fold. Oh man, this chalk line shows up so much better on black fabric. And then what I will actually do is I will actually just leave my pattern piece on there and I will cut around it using my scissors. This is now my chalk line. What that's going to cause is it's going to make this black piece a little tiny bit bigger than the fashion piece. Not much, less than 1/8 of an inch, but it will be bigger. And that's what we want. Okay? And I'm going to do that with most of my doublet pieces. They say, no, I didn't say all my doublet pieces. My collar piece does not need a lining piece to it. Okay? Like I said, we'll get to the lining of the collar piece later. So for right now, you can just set that aside. Yes?
Should we save any particular pieces of fabric for that later?
No, don't worry about it. My epaulette piece does not need a lining piece. If my fashion fabric is a fairly flimsy fabric, okay? It's a lighter cotton or, you know, a lighter brocade or whatever. I may want to cut a lining piece out just to add some stiffness to it, but this fabric that I'm using is nice and thick, and once it gets folded in half, you can see it actually has a good solid stiffness to it, so I'm really not going to need a lining piece on the inside of this. The epaulet lines itself. As you can see, it folds in half and it's already lined. So the only reason we would need another layer of fabric on the epaulet piece is to add a bit of stiffness. Okay, if you want to add a bit of stiffness, then yes, you will. Okay? Again, my skirting piece, I'm only going to need one more layer of it. So after I get one more layer of the skirting piece, I'm done. The back piece, the front piece, both sleeve pieces, and that, what did I call it? Placket piece, thank you. Losing my mind. The placket piece that will go down the front of the doublet will need 2 extra layers of lining. Okay, what?
Front piece.
Front piece, yes.
So when you lay that out on that fabric right there, it's going to give you 2 pieces.
Yes.
So you
And
don't.
so
you only need to do
you'll need to
one
cut
of
it
those.
again
Yes,
on
on a
the
bias.
bias.
But you only need to do one. Put down one of your front pieces.
Yes, you only need to put down one of your front pieces. I like to keep them stacked. Yeah. And again, I'm going to try and lay this out to conserve as much fabric as possible. Depending on how wide your fabric is, depends on where it's going to end up. You can turn it over and move it around and see where you can manage to squeeze pieces in, that kind of stuff. Nice thing about this lining piece is, well, there's no up or down to it. There's no pattern to it. I have used patterned lining pieces in the past. I've lined things with Mickey Mouse and roses and everything else. It's fun. Yeah. Nobody's ever going to see the lining, so it doesn't really matter what the lining piece is as long as it's a good, strong fabric that will help you pass a punch test. Because I cut my sleeves together, I double folded the fabric and then cut the sleeves. I'll have to take them apart so that I can make sure and cut out 2 sleeves every time. So when I lay my pattern out, I'm going to need to cut out 2 sleeves every time. And again, I'm going to want one on this, horizontal bias or horizontal direction of the fabric because everything else was cut on the vertical last time. And I'm going to want one cut out on the angled bias part, which wastes a lot of fabric, but hey, it adds strength. So for my rapier doublet, that's what I'm going to need to do. So I'm going to start cutting here in a second. You guys can see. But again, what I will do, I'll just cut this back piece out right now, since it doesn't really matter. As you can see, I'll just take this, and I will just cut while holding the 2 fabrics together. This is why we don't want to pick our scissors up. We want to slide them along the table. I cut past, and then I come in from the edge. And again, I had to cut that extra seam allowance in. And what I will do is I will actually use this piece to cut out the next piece of lining so that it's slightly bigger than this piece. It just helps. Okay? So you can see I've now cut my back piece up. Okay? And again, I'll try to keep these pieces separate and in their own little piles so that I know which pile is which and which pile which direction is going. Is that I want to take the pile where everything's cut on the horizontal grain and mix the back piece up that's on the bias with the front piece that's on the horizontal. Because that would just make a headache. Okay, so I'll show you what we're going to do with that and how we're going to put the pieces together as we go along. Okay, but that's the next step, that's the lining, and that's how you want to cut it. Okay? Any questions? No? Alright, because like I said, this is how I line up the second lining piece. Second lining piece is done on the bias. Again, you can see I've added the 1/2 inch to the seam allowance on the back piece because that's a fold, and we don't have a fold here anymore. I did the same thing on the sleeve pieces, 1/2 inch extra. Now, for our partlet piece, I got this nice big section that's on a fold right here. Since I'm only going to need one layer of that, after I cut all this out, I'll be able to unfold that and lay my partlet piece out on the bias and cut it out of that. So I'm not really worried about that piece right now. It's just a big rectangle anyways. It's easy to find a space for it. So you can see I've done my back, my front. This will give me 2 pieces because this is folded fabric. And then each of my sleeves. Those are the pieces I need for the second lining. Okay? Those are the only pieces I need for the second lining because those are the pieces that are needed for a punch test. Okay? Placket. Yeah, the placket. Partly placket, same difference. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Placket piece, yes. You can see where I've cut my skirting lining out, but I only needed 1 lining for the skirting piece. So, I mean, there's certain pieces that need 2 linings to be a rapier-legal doublet. The front, the front and the back, and the sleeves are those pieces, and of course the placket piece in the front that has the overlap. Got it? Yeah. All right, so we have our piles of fabric. We have our fashion pile, which is our fashion fabric. Got all our pieces cut out, and we put it in a nice neat little pile. We have our pile cut out going the opposite direction as our fashion. We went vertical here, horizontal here, okay? And then we have our bias cut pile, okay? Make sure to keep them in separate piles. If you have to, take a sticky note, pin it to the fabric, keep it a pile. I had one instructor, he would actually tie little pieces as a twine around each pile to make sure they keep them separate. Okay? This allows us to work in almost like an assembling line type of fashion. We do all of our pattern tracing out, then we do all of our cutting, then we do all of our serging. And then we pin up as much as we can, and we do all of our sewing for that. And we press all our seams, and then, and so on and so forth. It makes construction real easy. It also makes it real easy to construct multiple garments at the same time. Okay? In the next class, I'm actually going to cut out doublets for a couple more people, because I have the patterns and the material, and why not? And I will actually be constructing 3 doublets at the same time, while all of you do 1. So it'll just be easier for me. But that way I can get some stuff done that I want to get done. Anyways, so what I'm going to do next is I'm actually going to go to the serger, and I'm going to serge around the edges, every single edge of every single piece of pattern piece right here. Serging, to me, is an absolute necessity for creating lasting doublets, garments, whatever you want to call them. It makes washing them a whole lot easier and everything else. Just in the short period of time we've been handling these pieces of fabric, you can see all the fraying that is going on this piece of fabric. I handled this piece of fabric maybe 4 times. And I cut it, and it's already fraying all over the piece. Fabrics do that, they fray. And you can use pinking shears, and that will do a little bit. You can use a locking stitch on your machine, and that will do a little bit. It's still not going to hold it the way a serged edge will. Sergers are scary to some people because they have 4 spools of thread and they make a lot of noise and they move real fast. They're very simple. They're easier to use than most sewing machines. Do not be scared of them. Get yourself one. Have somebody show you how to use it, who knows how to use it, and you'll be like, wow, I can't believe this. And once you use one, you'll be like, I'm never going back to anything again. It makes construction so much easier. You never have to deal with frayed edges. You won't have to do French seaming to get rid of the raw edges. And like I said, I have doublets that are over 15 years old that have been washed hundreds of times, and they're still holding together. They still pass a punch test. they still are good looking garments because I serged the edges. Okay? I cannot stress this enough. Get a serger, learn how to use it. That's all I can say. So I'm going to go on and I'm going to start serging all these edges. You guys can continue to cut on your patterns next week. Next class, we're just going to continue to cut our patterns because we've got a lot of people missing tonight. So you guys just get cut out what you can tonight, probably just your fashion. And then we'll work on cutting your linings out and serging them next week. We got 2 sergers, so we'll get that done. Got it? Cool.
Yeah, we got that.